The house was quiet, almost too quiet. At 70 years old, Robert had grown accustomed to the stillness. It wasn't always like this. The grand, spacious home used to be filled with laughter, family gatherings, and the constant bustle of life. But those days were gone. His children had grown up, moved away, and built lives of their own, leaving him in a house that now felt more like a museum of memories than a home. Sitting in the living room, Robert stared at the photo on the mantel, an old family P. He smiled faintly, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. He missed those days, but as much as he longed for the past, he had no illusions about the future. He was getting older, and the house, once a symbol of pride and success, was becoming a burden. That's when his son, Jason, and daughter, Sarah, first brought up the idea. They had come for a rare visit, sitting down at the large dining table that hadn't seen much use lately. "Dad, we've been talking," Jason began, his tone carefully measured, as if testing the waters. "This house, it's too big for you now. You don't need all this space." Sarah nodded in agreement. "We've been thinking that it might be time to sell the house. You could come live with one of us and we'd help take care of everything." Robert frowned, the words hitting him harder than he expected. Sell the house? The idea seemed absurd at first. This was his home, the place where he had built his life, raised his children, and shared countless memories with his late wife. It wasn't just a building, it was a part of him. But as Jason and Sarah continued to speak, the cracks in his resolve began to show. They made good points. The house was too large for one person, and it was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. The garden alone, once his pride and joy, now felt like an overwhelming chore. "We're just thinking about what's best for you, Dad," Sarah added, her voice soft but firm. "You've done so much for us. Let us take care of you now." Robert sat silently, his mind racing. He didn't want to admit it, but they weren't entirely wrong. The loneliness was becoming harder to ignore, and the idea of living with his children, being surrounded by family again, was tempting. They made it sound so simple. Sell the house, move in with them, and live out his later years in comfort and secure. What could go wrong? After a long pause, Robert nodded. "I'll think about it." Jason and Sarah exchanged a glance, a small victory in their eyes. The conversation shifted to lighter topics after that, but the seed had been planted. Over the following weeks, Robert couldn't shake the idea. He wandered through the empty halls of his home, each room a reminder of the life that had once been, and each step weighed down by the reality of his aging. Eventually, the decision was made. After months of consideration, Robert agreed to sell the house. His children were thrilled, promising to handle all the details and make the transition as smooth as possible. He would move in with Jason first, they said, and if it didn't work out, Sarah's home would be the next option. The sale went quickly, almost too quickly for Robert's liking. Within weeks, the house he had lived in for decades was no longer his. The day he handed over the keys to the new owners, he felt a pang of regret, but he pushed it aside. This was for the best, he told himself. His children wanted to help him, and he would have a chance to spend more time with them, to be part of their lives again. But something gnawed at him. A small unsettling feeling that he couldn't quite shake. As he packed up his belongings, he caught himself wondering why Jason and Sarah were so eager to get him out of the house. Was it really about taking, or was there something else behind their motivations? He dismissed the thought as quickly as it came. He loved his children, and they loved him. There was no reason to doubt them. They were his family after all. They only wanted what was best for him. On the day of the move, Robert stood in the now empty living room, his heart heavy as he took one last look around. The walls, once filled with the sounds of life, now stood silent. The house, his home, was no longer his. Jason arrived in his car, a wide smile on his face. "Ready, Dad?" he asked cheerfully. Robert forced a smile and nodded, but inside something felt off. Still, he climbed into the car, telling himself that this was a new chapter, one that would bring him closer to his children. But as they drove away, leaving the house behind, that unsettling feeling in the pit of his stomach only grew stronger. The drive to Jason's house was long and quiet. Robert sat in the passenger seat, glancing out the window at the passing scenery, but his mind was elsewhere. He tried to convince himself that moving in with his son was the right decision. After all, Jason had promised that this would be temporary, a chance for him to relax and be taken care of. But deep down, Robert couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. They pulled into the driveway of Jason's house, a modern suburban home, neat and sterile. As they stepped out of the car, Jason motioned for Robert to grab only a small suitcase from the trunk. The rest of his belongings, his furniture, and his memories had already been sold or packed away. "You don't need to bring much, Dad," Jason said, his voice casual but firm. "We've arranged something more permanent for you." Robert stopped in his tracks, the words hanging in the air. Permanent? That wasn't part of the plan. He had thought he would live with Jason, at least for a while, perhaps even rotate between Jason and Sarah. But the way his son said permanent made his stomach churn. "What do you mean, more permanent?" Robert asked, his voice strained. Jason glanced at his father, avoiding direct eye contact. "Look, Dad, Sarah and I talked about it. We think the best place for you is somewhere where you'll have constant care. A place where people are trained to help you." Robert's heart sank. "What are you? You promised I'd live with you." Jason let out a sigh, clearly uncomfortable. "I know, but after thinking it over, we realized that it's not practical. You need more help than we can provide. So we found a facility. It's nice, really. You'll have everything you need." "A facility?" Robert's voice trembled with disbelief. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. "You mean a nursing home?" Jason nodded slowly. "Yes, Dad. It's for your own good. You'll be safer there, and Sarah and I will be. It's not like we're abandoning you." Robert stood frozen, the weight of the betrayal crushing him. His own children had tricked him into selling his home, only to put him in a place he had sworn he would never end up, a nursing home. For years, he had dreaded the idea of living out his final days in one of those places. He had seen it happen to others, forgotten, neglected, left to wither away. And now, it was happening to him. "I'm not going to a home," Robert said, his voice firm despite the loo. "I'm your father, Jason. I trusted you." Jason shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his watch as if he was eager to be done with the conversation. "Dad, we've already made the arrangements. They're expecting you today. It's a good place, I promise." Before Robert could protest further, another car pulled up beside them. Sarah stepped out, her face a mixture of guilt and determination. She walked over to them, placing a hand on Robert's arm. "Dad," she began gently, "this is for the best. We just want you to be comfortable. You'll have your own space, your own routine. You won't have to worry about anything." Robert's heart ached as he looked at his daughter, hoping to find some compassion in her eyes. But all he saw was resolve. She had already made up her mind. "I can't believe this," Robert muttered, shaking his head. "After everything I've done for you two, this is how you repay me." "Dad, please don't make this harder than it has to be," Sarah said, her voice tight with empathy. "Let's just get you settled, okay?" Robert felt a wave of helplessness wash over him. He had no choice. They had taken everything from him, his home, his independence, his trust. Without saying another word, he climbed back into Jason's car, his body heavy with resignation. The drive to the facility was short, but it felt like a lifetime. Robert stared out the window, numb to the world around him. When they finally arrived, he was greeted by a drab, gray building with peeling paint and overgrown. It looked nothing like the nice place Jason had described. "This is it," Jason said, pulling into the parking lot. He tried to sound upbeat, but Robert could hear the strain in his voice. Sarah followed close behind, her expression unreadable. They walked through the doors of the facility, and Robert's heart sank even further. The smell of disinfectant and stale air hit him immediately. The halls were dimly lit, and the few residents he saw were hunched over in wheelchairs, staring vacantly at It was exactly what he had feared. "Welcome to nursing home," a nurse said with a forced smile as they approached the reception desk. "We've been expecting you, Mr. Bennett." Robert barely heard her. His eyes were fixed on the bleak surroundings, his mind struggling to process what was happening. His children, the ones he had raised and sacrificed for, had brought him here to rot. "I'll leave you in good hands," Jason said quickly, as if eager to leave. "We'll come by next week to check on you." "Yeah, we'll visit," Sarah added, though her tone lacked sincerity. Robert turned to look at them, his eyes burning with a mixture of anger and sadness. "You're leaving me here?" Jason and Sarah exchanged glances before Jason spoke again. "It's just for a while, Dad. You'll get used to it." But Robert knew better. This wasn't temporary. This was where they intended to leave him, and deep down, he feared they wouldn't be back. Without another word, they turned and walked out, leaving Robert standing alone in the cold, sterile hallway of nursing home. He felt a lump form in his throat, but he swallowed it down. He wouldn't let them see him break. Not yet. The first few days at nursing home were a blur. Robert found himself drifting between confusion and anger, unsure of how he had ended up in this bleak place. The facility was everything he had feared: cold, sterile, and utterly devoid of life. The residents shuffled through the hallways like shadows, their eyes hollow, their bodies slumped over in wheelchairs or propped up by nurses. No one spoke unless necessary. It was as if the very walls of the building had absorbed the despair that lived within them. Robert kept mostly to himself. He had been given a small room with a bed, a chair, and a nightstand. It was far from the home he had known, the home filled with memories, laughter, and warmth. Here the silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional distant chatter of staff or the faint hum of machines, keeping some of the residents alive. Sitting by the window in his room, Robert stared out at the overgrown courtyard below. He could see a couple of nurses walking slowly with an elderly woman, her steps faltering with every move. The sight of it made his chest tighten. "This is my future," he thought bitterly. "This is what my children have condemned me to." The betrayal gnawed at him. Jason and Sarah, the children he had worked so hard to provide for, had abandoned him. And for what? For convenience? To wash their hands of the responsibility of caring for him in his old age? The more he thought about it, the angrier he became. He had trusted them, believed they had his best interests at heart, but now, as he sat in this miserable room, it was clear they had only been thinking of themselves. Days turned into weeks, and Robert began to notice the toll the environment was taking on him. His energy was draining, his mind clouded by the monotony of each day. Meals were bland and tasteless, served in the dimly lit dining hall where residents sat in silence, pushing their food around on their plates. There were no conversations, no laughter, no signs of life. Just the quiet acceptance of the staff was indifferent. They did their jobs, taking vitals, handing out medication, and helping the most frail residents with basic tasks. But there was no compassion, no real connection. To them, Robert and the others were just names on a chart, bodies to be managed. It was during one of those long, empty afternoons that Robert met Frank. Frank was an older man, perhaps a few years Robert's senior, with a weathered face and a wry smile that suggested he hadn't yet succumbed to the lifelessness. He'd been sitting alone in the courtyard when Robert wandered outside one day, seeking some fresh air and an escape from the suffocating walls of nursing home. "New here, huh?" Frank's voice was raspy, but there was a spark in his eyes that caught Robert off guard. Robert nodded, unsure of what to say. He had avoided making friends with the other residents, afraid that engaging with them would only make his situation more real. "Don't worry, you'll get used to it," Frank said, leaning back in his chair with a slow grin. "Or at least that's what they tell you." Robert raised an eyebrow. "Do you believe that?" Frank chuckled softly. "Hell no. But you've got two choices in a place like this. You either let it break you or you find a way to survive." Robert looked at him, surprised by the man's candor. "And how do you survive in a place like this?" Frank shrugged. "By not giving up. You find small things, little bits of control over your life. They take away your freedom when they bring you here, but they can't take away your mind unless you let them. Those words struck a chord in Robert. He had felt like his world was collapsing in on him since he had arrived, but Frank's resilience sparked something inside him. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way to survive this nightmare without letting it consume him. Over the next few weeks, Robert began spending more time with Frank. They would sit together in the courtyard, trading stories about their pasts, their families, and how they had ended up in nursing home. Frank had a sharp wit and a rebellious spirit that reminded Robert of the man he had once been. Strong, independent, unafraid to fight for what he wanted. It was during one of their conversations that Frank said something that changed everything. "They want us to fade away here," Frank muttered one afternoon, his eyes narrowing as he gazed out at the courtyard. "But we don't have to, we can fight back. It's all about taking back control, one step at a time." Robert stared at him, the wheels in his mind turning. Maybe Frank was right. Maybe he didn't have to accept this fate, this slow descent into nothingness. Maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to regain some control over his life. And for the first time since arriving at nursing home, Robert felt a flicker of hope. Chapter 4. The Internal Transformation. Word count, 900. The days passed, but Robert no longer felt as though he was simply waiting for the inevitable. Frank's words had ignited something within him, a sense that he wasn't as powerless as he had been led to believe. The walls of the nursing home, once oppressive and confining, now felt less like a prison and more like a challenge. Robert wasn't ready to give up, not yet. He began to develop small routines, little acts of defiance against the monotony that threatened to swallow him whole. Each morning he made it a point to take a walk through the courtyard, feeling the sun on his skin, breathing in the fresh air. It was a simple act, but it reminded him that there was still life outside the sterile walls of the facility. Slowly, Robert started talking to the other residents. He had been avoiding them since his arrival, afraid that forming connections would only make his situation feel more permanent. But now, he saw them differently. They weren't just the quiet, shuffling figures he had once dismissed. They were people, like him, people who had been forgotten, abandoned by the ones they loved. And like him, they had resigned themselves to a fate they hadn't chosen. One afternoon, as Robert sat in the dining hall, he noticed an elderly woman struggling to lift her SPO. Her hands shook and the staff, busy with other tasks, didn't seem to notice. Without thinking, Robert stood up and walked over to her. "Here, let me help you with that," he said gently, taking the spoon from her trembling hand. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with surprise. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Robert smiled and helped her finish her meal. It was a small gesture, but something about it felt significant. He had spent weeks feeling like a burden, like his life no longer had purpose. But in that moment, helping someone else, he realized that he still had something to offer. He wasn't as helpless as he had believed. Word of Robert's small acts of kindness began to spread among the residents. Soon others were seeking him out for help, whether it was assisting with a meal, lending a sympathetic ear, or simply offering a smile. He became a quiet leader within the community, a role he hadn't expected but one that felt natural. Frank noticed the change in him. "Looks like you're getting the hang of it," he said with a smirk, as they sat together in the courtyard one afternoon. Robert chuckled softly. "I guess I am. It feels good, you know, to be useful again." Frank nodded. "That's the key, Robert. They want us to feel like we're just waiting for the end, like we don't matter anymore. But as long as you've got your mind, as long as you can help someone else, you've still got something they can't take away." Robert thought about that for a long time after Frank said it. He realized that he had spent so much time focusing on what he had lost, his home, his independence, his relationship with his children, that he had forgotten to see what he still had. He had his health, his mind, and most importantly, he had the ability to make a difference in the lives of the people around him. With that realization came a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He started organizing small activities for the residents, simple things like card games or walks around the courtyard. The staff, at first indifferent, began to take notice. Some even seemed grateful for the help as Robert's leadership lightened their workload. As time passed, the atmosphere in the nursing home began to shift. The residents, once listless and resigned, started to show signs of life. Conversations grew livelier, small groups began to form, and even the dining hall felt less like a morgue and more like a place where people gathered to share their days. But Robert knew it wasn't enough. This wasn't just about making the best of a bad situation. It was about reclaiming his dignity, his autonomy, and his future. He had been placed in this facility without his consent, and though he had found a way to survive, he wasn't content to stay here forever. One evening, as he and Frank sat together watching the sunset, Robert voiced his thoughts aloud. "I don't belong here, Frank. I can't stay in this place for the rest of my life." Frank glanced at him, his eyes serious. "I know, Robert, but what are you going to do about it?" That question lingered in the air between them. For the first time since his arrival, Robert wasn't just thinking about surviving. He was thinking about how to escape. Not physically, perhaps, but mentally and emotionally. He wasn't going to let his children or this facility define the rest of his life. "I'll find a way," Robert said, his voice steady with newfound determination. "I'm not done yet." Frank smiled faintly, nodding in approval. "Good, because giving up? That's not in our nature." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the courtyard, Robert felt a sense of calm settle over him. He didn't know exactly what his next steps would be, but for the first time in a long time, he felt in control of his own destiny. It had been years since Robert had seen his children. Despite their promises to visit regularly, Jason and Sarah had barely made an effort. In the beginning, there had been a few phone calls, short, awkward conversations that left Robert feeling more disconnected than ever. But eventually, even those stopped. Now his only contact with them came in the form of occasional postcards and holiday cards, each one more impersonal than the last. But today was different. Today, Jason and Sarah were coming to visit. The nursing home buzzed with quiet activity that morning as the staff prepared for the visit. The administration had been informed that Robert's children were important people, and they wanted to make sure the facility looked presentable. Rooms were tidied up. The dining hall was given a once-over, and the nurses tried their best to hide the everyday grimness of the place. Robert sat by the window in his room, watching the staff rush around. He had been told the night before that his children were coming, but he wasn't sure how he felt about it. On the one hand, he was curious to see them, to find out what had brought them here after all this time. On the other hand, a part of him didn't care anymore. He had built a new life for himself here, among the residents and staff. He had found a sense of purpose that his children had tried to take from him. Frank walked into the room and sat down beside Robert, offering a knowing glance. "So, today's the big day, huh? The prodigal children finally return." Robert smirked. "Seems like it. Took them long enough." Frank chuckled, shaking his head. "You ready for it?" Robert leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "I don't know. I've thought a lot about what I'd say if I ever saw them again. But now that it's happening, I'm not sure I care as much as I used to." Frank nodded. "That's the thing about people like them. Once you realize they don't have power over you anymore, they don't seem so important." Robert glanced out the window again, watching as a sleek black car pulled up in front of the nursing home. His heart gave a small, involuntary jolt, but he quickly composed himself. This was no longer about pleasing her. This was about confronting them with the truth. Jason and Sarah stepped out of the car, both dressed in expensive clothes, their faces carefully composed. Robert watched as they approached the entrance, their steps slow and measured, as if they were unsure of what to expect. "Here we go," Robert muttered under his breath, standing up from his chair. Frank gave him a pat on the shoulder. "You'll be fine. Just remember, you're in control now." A nurse knocked on the door and peeked in. "Mr. Bennett, your children are here to see you." Robert nodded and followed her down the hallway to the visitors' lounge. His steps were steady, his face calm, but inside, he could feel a mixture of emotions bubbling to the surface: anger, hurt, and a strange sense of anticipation. He wasn't the same man they had left here years ago, and he was eager for them to see that. When he entered the lounge, Jason and Sarah were already seated, their faces showing a mixture of awkwardness and forced politeness. Jason was the first to speak. "Dad, it's good to see you," he said, standing up and offering a stiff smile. Sarah followed suit, her voice just as formal. "We've been meaning to visit sooner, but things have been so busy." Robert sat down across from them, eyeing them carefully. They both looked different. Older, certainly, but there was something else. They seemed more polished, more distant, as if time had smoothed over any traces of the warmth they once had. It struck him that he barely reckoned. "I wasn't expecting to see either of you again," Robert said bluntly, his tone neutral. Jason and Sarah exchanged uncomfortable glances. "We've been busy," Jason repeated, as if that excuse would erase the years of absence. Robert leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "Busy enough to forget about your father, I suppose." Sarah shifted in her seat, her discomfort evident. "Dad, that's not fair. We didn't forget about you. We just thought you were being taken care of here." "Taken car." Robert's voice grew sharper. "Is that what you think this place is? Somewhere to dump me so you wouldn't have to deal with the inconvenience?" Jason held up his hands defensively. "We didn't dump you. We thought this was the best option. You needed more help than we could give." "And that's the story you've been telling yourselves, isn't it?" Robert said coldly. "That it was for my own good. That leaving me here was a favor. Well, let me tell you something. You didn't do me any favors. You took away my home, my independence, and my trust in you." The room fell silent. Jason and Sarah looked down, clearly not expecting this confrontation. Robert could see the guilt in their eyes, but it didn't move him. He had spent too long letting their actions define his life, and now he was done. "I've built a life for myself here," Robert continued, his voice steady. "I've made friends, found purpose, and none of it is because of you. It's despite you." Sarah looked up, her eyes wide. "Dad, we didn't know—" "No," Robert interrupted. "You didn't care, but that's okay. I've learned to stop caring about what you think of me." Jason cleared his throat, trying to salvage the conversation. "We came to check on you, Dad, to see how you're doing." "Well, now you know," Robert said, standing up. "I'm doing just fine, and I don't need anything from either of you." Jason and Sarah stood as well, their faces pale and unsure. "Dad, we'll come visit again," Jason said, but his voice lacked conviction. Robert shook his head. "Don't bother." Without another word, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving his children standing there, stunned and speechless. For the first time in years, Robert felt truly free. Robert walked back to his room with a sense of finality washing over him. The confrontation with Jason and Sarah had been the release he hadn't realized he needed. For years he had carried the weight of their betrayal, the anger festering, but now it felt as if that burden had been lifted. He had said what needed to be said, and in doing so, he had taken back control of his own life. As he entered his room, he found Frank waiting for him, his expression calm but curious. "So, how did it go?" Robert sat down, exhaling deeply. "Better than I expected. I told them the truth, that I don't need them anymore." Frank smiled approvingly. "Good for you. Feels good, doesn't it?" Robert nodded, the tension in his body easing as he leaned. "It does. I think for the first time I actually believe it." There was a long pause between them, the weight of the conversation lingering in the air. Robert had thought for so long that his future depended on his children, that they held the key to his happiness, but now he realized the truth. His life, his future, was his own to shape. "I'm not going back to them," Robert said firmly. "I've made my decision." Frank raised an eyebrow. What are you going to do? Robert glanced around the room. The same space that had once felt like a prison now felt like a place of transition, a temporary stop on his journey to something better. I'm going to stay here for now, Robert replied. But not as a victim. I'm going to use my resources to make this place better, for me and for everyone else here. Frank nodded, a satisfied look on his face. That's what I like to hear. Turning the tables. Robert smiled. It wasn't the future he had once imagined for himself, but it was a future he could live with. One where he had power over his own choices, his own destiny. And that was more than enough. As the sun set outside, casting long shadows across the room, Robert felt a sense of peace. His children had tried to take away his autonomy, but they had failed. He had found a new sense of purpose, not only for himself, but for those around him. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. If you enjoyed this story, click the card above to watch more heartwarming stories like this one. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and leave a comment below. I love reading your comments and hearing what you think. Your feedback helps me create even more stories you'll enjoy. So drop a comment and let me know your thoughts.